Hello Year 9, it's Miss Hogan here. It's great to be here teaching you all again. So first of all, I'm going to give you a moment to get your title down. Our question today is, how does Arthur Conan Doyle utilise Gothic conventions in The Hound of the Baskervilles? And your bell task is just a quick memory check from the work you've been doing on your project on the Gothic, which you should have been working on over the past couple of weeks. What I want you to do is to match each of the images on the slide to one convention from the Gothic genre. You might want to pause the video now and take a moment to jot those down. Okay, so here are some ideas that you could have come up with. What I want you to do is to jot them down if these are ones that you hadn't come up with yourself, because these are going to be really useful as we go through the lesson. So first of all, this picture at the top left is very reminiscent of the ancient ruined settings that we see throughout Gothic fiction, the classic castles, graveyards, and that typical haunted house that you should be very familiar with. And next we have the theme of mystery and secrecy. Gothic texts are often centred around some mystery, something that as readers we would like to get to the bottom of alongside the character or the narrator. And then over here on the right, we've got an example of the kind of barren, desolate landscapes that are so commonly associated with the Gothic. That sense of isolation that these landscapes create is very crucial to the fear that the characters feel and that we as readers can empathise with. And then down here on the right, we've got this idea of the supernatural. Often Gothic writers incorporate the supernatural into their text, whether that's ghosts like in the image, or vampires, monsters, creatures, something unnatural of which we know we should be afraid. And then lastly, that sense of terror and suspense, which I suppose is the aim of any Gothic writer. They want us to feel that sense of terror and that suspense that the character or the narrator is also experiencing. So make sure you've got those down, because like I say, they're going to be really useful as we move on. So here on this slide we have the extract that we're going to focus on today. So this particular extract is from chapter 10 of The Hound of the Baskervilles by Arthur Conan Doyle. I'm sure most of you are familiar with the character of Sherlock Holmes, whether you've read some Sherlock Holmes texts previously or whether you've seen the TV series or the films that are quite popular at the moment. Now, this particular text is telling the story of Holmes and Watson, who are investigating the legend of this supernatural hound which is stalking the young heir to the Baskerville fortune. This hound, which has supposedly, legend says, been responsible for killing Sir Baskerville's ancestors. So I want you to pause the video to give yourself a chance to really read this extract very carefully and familiarise yourself with it before we move on. So the first activity that I want you to try today requires you to think really carefully about the ambitious vocabulary that we were faced with in this extract. There are 5 words on the slide that I really want you to think very carefully about. We have melancholy, baronet, baying, fiend and tor. So the first thing I want you to do for each of these words is to locate them in the extract. It's really important when we're dealing with new, unfamiliar vocabulary that we contextualise it, that we see where and when it's being used in a sentence, and that gives us a better understanding of its meaning. And then I want you to research the definitions, whether you have a dictionary to hand or you could use Google Dictionary to do that. And then lastly, I want you to think about, well, what makes these words particularly Gothic? Why would I have chosen these words? Because there are a lot of impressive words in that extract. Why would I have picked these 5 when we're talking about the Gothic? So pause the video now and give yourself about 5 minutes to do this task. Okay, now we're going to go through the answers. Make sure that you jot down any corrections or additions to the definitions because they could be useful later on. So first of all, we have melancholy. Melancholy is an emotion, it's a feeling, a very sorrowful, pensive feeling. One that's very symptomatic of Gothic fiction. That melancholy mood is one that you'll see a lot throughout Gothic poetry and also Gothic novels. Secondly, baronet, that's a title that's given to a gentleman. It's somebody who could be referred to as Sir. And I think that really speaks to the theme of power, which is often at play in the Gothic. The Gothics, like we said, very interested in these grand settings, the castles, the mansions, the big stately homes. And therefore it's also very interested in the people who inhabit them, people who have power, and then those who also don't. Thirdly, we've got the verb being. Now, as you know, this extract comes from Hound of the Baskervilles, and being is a sound. It's creating that auditory imagery of a barking, howling noise. And if we really think about that sound of a howl, we can really see how that would create quite an eerie, Gothic mood. And number 4, fiend. Now, a fiend is a villain or a monster. And like we said, Gothic fiction, when we're reading Gothic fiction, it really relies on there being something that we need to be afraid of, that fiend. And lastly, Tor. In your bell task, we talked about the types of barren, desolate landscapes that feed into the sense of isolation within the Gothic. And a tor is an example of one of those. It's a hill or a rocky peak. So make sure you've jotted those down and made any corrections that you needed to. Our next activity is a quotation explosion. Now, you should be very, very familiar with quotation explosions from your work in class, but just in case, I've given you a reminder of the steps in the box to the top right, and I've suggested some words from the quotation that might interest you. You'll see those in blue and in purple. So what I want you to do is to think about our big question, that how is this setting Gothic? Think of some big ideas, pick out some language methods, some words you can zoom in on, and then zoom back out to that overall effect on the reader. So pause the video and give yourself about 5 minutes to read and annotate the quotation with as many ideas as you can. Okay, so here are some ideas for how we could explode this particular quotation with the Gothic in mind. So this one was all about the setting. We've got a dull and foggy day with a drizzle of rain. The house is banked in with rolling clouds which rise now and then to show the dreary curves of the moor, with thin silver veins upon the sides of the hills, and the distant boulders gleaming where the light strikes upon their wet faces. It is melancholy outside and in. Make sure that as we go through the quotation, you're adding to your own quotation explosion with annotations, because this will be useful for the next task. So first of all, my big idea, I really picked out the gloomy atmosphere that we feel when we're reading this quotation. It really creates that sense of an isolated setting. And that's partly due to this semantic field of gloom, the words that I've picked out in blue: dull, foggy, drizzle, clouds and dreary. Remember, a semantic field is a group of words that all come together to create a mood and a meaning. So these words in particular help us to imagine just how dreary, how gloomy this setting is supposed to be. And then as I went on, I started to think about this idea of the house being banked in by the weather, the clouds and the rain and the fog. And it really gives us that sense that nature's alive. It's closing in on the house and dominating it. And that particularly comes through, doesn't it, with the metaphor of the silver veins on the sides of the hills being used to describe the fog and the mist. And that really adds to the gloomy atmosphere. It's almost like the gloomy atmosphere is flowing through the setting. And we really get that, don't we, from the noun veins, this sense that it's flowing through the setting. And that makes the reader imagine, doesn't it, that, well, if this setting is isolated and exposed to the elements, then so too are the people who are there. They are exposed, they are isolated, and they are at risk. This is an eerie, suspenseful place. And then looking at the house itself, well, we see that it's melancholy outside and in. The house itself really reflects the mood of those who inhabit it, that melancholy from your previous task. And by attributing an emotion to the house, the writer's using, of course, personification. The house both feels sorrow itself, its melancholy inside, but it's also surrounded by melancholy, I suppose, which is symbolised, isn't it, by the fog, the drizzle, and the clouds. And so zooming out to bring all that together, we go back to the Gothic genre and Gothic conventions within this setting. The house is shrouded in mystery. It's shrouded in mystery both physically by the clouds and the fog and the drizzle, but also metaphorically by that sense of death and the legends and the superstitions that are mentioned in the second half of the extract. This sense that this family is being preyed upon by the supernatural hound. Okay, so take a moment and make sure that you get down anything there so that your quotation is full of ideas that you can use. And that's especially important because next up, it's time for you to write up your ideas in an extended response. And I want you just to do your response about our quotation, the one that we've done all of that work on already. So a reminder, the question is, how does Arthur Conan Doyle utilise Gothic conventions in The Hound of the Baskervilles? And I want you to aim for one detailed paragraph. Now, you should all be really familiar with what, how, why paragraphs or Zoom paragraphs from class, but just in case, I've written some reminders of what should be included in each step. And remember, as you're answering these little questions and prompts, to refer back to your quotation explosion for ideas. So open it up with your what, your big idea. I want you to think about what makes this setting particularly Gothic. Think about what it is about the atmosphere that the writer creates that is so Gothic. And then in your how section, you're going to move on to how do specific language methods and specific words from the quotation we exploded show this. So whether those are words from that semantic field, that word melancholy, or that noun veins, which we talked about each of those in a little bit of detail. And then lastly, and this should really be the most detailed part of your paragraph, I want you to think about, well, why would the writer do this? Why would he use these words? What effect is he trying to have on the reader by choosing these words specifically? So pause the video now, and I want you to give yourself no more than 10 minutes to complete your answer. Remember, we're aiming for one detailed paragraph. So here's a model response to your question, and I want you to take a moment now to carefully read it and compare it to your own. Try to think about, well, how does this response answer each of those what, how, why questions? In particular, think about how that quotation's been picked apart and how a specific word's been really zoomed in on, but then brought back out to this sense of the Gothic and the effect on the reader. So pause the video now, please, and I want you to aim to improve at least one section of your response with something that's really stood out to you from this model answer. Okay, now it's really time to challenge ourselves, Year 9. We're going to not only think about the language of the extract, but we're also going to think about the form or the structure as well. Below, you're going to see a new piece of vocabulary, critical vocabulary, epistolary narrative, and I've given you a bit of a clue on the slide there. So your next task is going to be to pause the video and research exactly what this term means. Make sure you write that down. And also, I want you to think about, well, epistolary narrative, once you know what it means, how could it be a Gothic convention in itself? Why would this style of writing and this form really appeal to a Gothic writer in particular? Okay, so here's the definition. You should have been able to find that on Google yourself. So an epistolary narrative is a narrative constructed from a series of diary entries or letters. Epistolary, linking to that Latin word epistula, which means letter. So that's where that comes from. Epistolary narratives been really popular with Gothic writers. Some famous examples. We see letters in Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and we see both diary entries and letters in Bram Stoker's Dracula. But what I want us to think about is, well, what makes the epistolary narrative a Gothic convention? Why would a Gothic writer particularly want to write in a diary style or in the style of a series of letters? Well, first of all, it gives us as readers that sense that we're reading something private. I hope you wouldn't all go and read somebody else's diary, or you wouldn't pick up and read a letter that wasn't addressed to you. So in the same way, by reading something that we're supposed to believe is a diary or a letter, we feel like we're invading somebody's personal memoirs, that this is a secret that we weren't actually supposed to be party to. Think about that Bell task where we talked about mystery and secrecy. And secondly, this form, the epistolary narrative, makes it feel as though the diary or the letters have been passed on to the writer like a legend. Often the Gothic writers want us to believe that they've just stumbled upon this diary, or they found this collection of letters and then they compiled those and put them in a novel for us, that they believed there was something in this diary or in this letter that was worth us finding out about and would really intrigue us as readers. But that requires us, doesn't it, to have that sense of faith, which fiction so often does. And then lastly, you are all really familiar with first person narrative perspective. with texts that are written from the perspective of a character. However, there's something quite unique about a diary, or especially a letter, in that we get this sense of what we call an unreliable narrator. We're able to doubt the narrator a little bit, because if this is something that they chose to record in their own personal diary, or that they chose to write to somebody else, how do we know that it's exactly truthful and accurate and factual? Because by the very nature of a first person account, we're bringing emotions and feelings into play, aren't we? And we get that in this little section of the extract. He says, "I'm conscious myself of a weight at my heart and a feeling of impending danger, ever-present danger, which is the more terrible because I am unable to define it." So we're dealing with a narrator here who's very, very scared and aware of the danger around him. And he's dealing with the unknown, that Gothic sense of the unknown. So we've got to think about, as readers, well, to what extent is what we're reading his perspective, his viewpoint, his version of events? Because somebody who's finding something very frightening is going to write about it in a way that makes it frightening and seem frightening to us as readers. So when a Gothic writer channels that fictional first person perspective, particularly in a diary or a letter, you could really think about, well, to what extent is this narration reliable? Why is he choosing to write about this? And what emotions of his really shine through the extract? So finally, what I want you to do is to think about what we've just discussed, and I want you to add one sentence to your what, how, why, your Zoom paragraph, explaining how the epistolary narrative contributes to the Gothic atmosphere. So you should have discussed how that setting was particularly gloomy, particularly Gothic. And what I want you to do now is think, well, how does that link to the effects and the impact of the epistolary narrative of this diary entry that we're getting in The Hound of the Baskervilles? So give yourself a moment to jot that down, to really add that last bit of challenge to your paragraph. And if you've been able to talk about that effectively, then you've constructed a really, really successful, impressive piece of analytical writing, where you've not only discussed language methods, but you've also included that form, structure, and the context of the genre, which is just amazing. So that's all for today. Thank you very, very much, Year 9, and well done. I will hopefully see you all soon.